Dick's 9th appearance, I believe, at the library. He's done all his history talks for us, and today he's talking about remembering the USS Indianapolis and her crew. Dick Campbell.
Well, good noon. I was going to say good morning or good afternoon. It's good noon, according to my clock. It's good to be back here with you. Again, my name is Dick Campbell. I'm from Oshkosh, Wisconsin. And for many years, I always like to share that actually for 73 years, I've been a student of history. And with this interest, since 1999, I've created a variety of 9 history talks, which shown here, which I've presented many times in local Oshkosh community groups and many other organizations throughout Wisconsin, Indianapolis, Indiana, and even up in Fairbanks, Alaska. And as Peg mentioned, it's been a pleasure for me to come over here 9 times. I think this is my 10th time. We did the Shackleton talk twice here. And it's always a pleasure to come over to the Waupaca Library and share stories with you. And now I'd like to share one of these moments with you entitled, Remembering the USS Indianapolis and Her Crew. If the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, historically marks the entry of the United States into the conflict which became the Second World War, then surely the tragedy of the USS Indianapolis must stand as an historical mark of conclusion. There are those who will argue the dropping of the atom bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki ended it, without question. But the period of time from the USS Arizona to the USS Indianapolis stands as the alpha and omega of the war for the U.S. Navy. While Arizona, sunk at Pierside, has been memorialized at Pearl Harbor, the Indianapolis, which fought the good fight throughout the war and played such a key role in ending the war in the Pacific, only to be the final naval casualty, was finally memorialized in downtown Indianapolis, Indiana, on August 2, 1995. A piece of the USS Arizona was placed inside the monument, as these 2 ships were the first and last vessels to be sunk during the struggle for freedom. The tragedy of the USS Indianapolis, a proud and gallant ship, stands as the largest single disaster at sea ever suffered by the U.S. Navy in its long and honorable history. This is her story. The ship. The heavy cruiser USS Indianapolis was commissioned in November 1932. And from her inception, she was the pride of the U.S. Navy, representing as she did all the very latest technology of her day. Perhaps the highlight of Indianapolis's peacetime career was her presidential cruise to South America in 1936. At that time, she took then President Franklin Roosevelt to a Pan American conference in Buenos Aires. This was the first time in history that a serving president of the United States had visited outside North America. Incidentally, this is a very rare picture, as President Roosevelt was seldom photographed in his wheelchair during his presidency. Roosevelt chose the Indianapolis as his ship of state, using her as his personal transport for transatlantic travel on numerous occasions. Many of the world's leaders and royalty toured her deck as guests of the United States, as shown here with Winston Churchill. She became the symbol of a dynamic young America wherever she went. In April 1940, the U.S. fleet was moved from the west coast of California to Pearl Harbor in Hawaii as a deterrent to potential Japanese aggression at that time. The Indianapolis went with it, and on the day the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor, December 7, 1941, the Indianapolis was conveniently out of her home port on maneuvers. It is noteworthy to mention here that all of the 3 U.S. aircraft carriers assigned to Pearl Harbor at that time were also out of Pearl as well. The Indianapolis saw its first combat of World War II in February of 1942. She became the flagship for Admiral Blaman Spruance, commander of the 5th Fleet, and saw extensive combat duty in the South Pacific, receiving 10 battle stars from March of 1942 through April of 1945 for the following engagements: Bougainville, Aleutians, Gilbert Island, Marshall Island, Asiatic Pacific, Marianas, Tinian Island, Western Carolina, Japanese Home Islands, and Okinawa. On March 31, 1945, while Indianapolis was participating in the battle for Okinawa, a Japanese kamikaze suicide plane crashed into the port side of the ship with its 500-pound bomb, killing 9 and injuring 26. 2 holes were blown in the ship's bottom, and several compartments were flooded. This tragic event set the stage for Indianapolis's place in history. After emergency repairs, the Indianapolis, under her own power, limped back to Mare Island near San Francisco, California, for extensive repairs in dry dock. While the Indianapolis was in dry dock at Mare Island, the War Department chose this ship to transport the atom bomb components to Tinian Island. And because of her great speed, her availability, and proximity to Los Alamos, New Mexico, where the Manhattan Project was based, she had been tapped for history. The Manhattan Project, America's top secret atom bomb effort, proved a success following tests on July 16, 1945 at Los Alamos. In the early morning hours of that very same day, shrouded in security and secrecy, the atom bomb components, known as Little Boy, shown here, were loaded aboard the Indianapolis. The heart of 2 bombs, uranium-235, was sealed in a lead-lined metal container. The nature of the cargo itself was kept secret from all aboard, including the ship's commander, 46-year-old Captain Charles B. McVeigh III. The Indianapolis sailed into history that day. Following a record-setting 3-day run from San Francisco, California to Pearl Harbor, Hawaii on July 19, then after a 7-day run, the Indianapolis anchored on July 26 off the island of Tinian in the Western Pacific and offloaded its cargo. Tinian was home to one of the busiest airfields in the world at that time, the staging area for air raids on Japan by B-29s. From Tinian, the Indianapolis sailed south and made a brief stop at the island of Guam to replenish supplies and receive new orders. Her orders were to travel to Leyte on the coast of the Philippines, some 1,300 miles west of Guam, and there to join the battleship USS Idaho for gunnery practice in preparation for the invasion of Japan, which at that time was scheduled for around November 1, 1945. McVeigh asked for an escort ship, as the Indianapolis was not equipped with sonar, and therefore had no way to detect enemy submarines. He was told no escort was needed. He would make do, even though the Indianapolis would be the first capital ship to sail from Guam to Leyte unescorted since the war began. The Indianapolis steamed out of Guam at 1600 hours on Saturday, July 28, unescorted, on a planned 3-day voyage to Leyte. At midnight, July 29:30, the Indianapolis was in a moderate sea with visibility poor, but improving under overcast skies. She had secured from zigzagging earlier in the evening. Shortly before midnight, and approximately halfway between Leyte and Guam, the Japanese submarine I-58, under the command of Mokachura Hashimoto, was sweeping the surface with its long-range periscope and listening with its upgraded passive sonar. When he picked up the Indianapolis, he waited until he got close enough to see what it was, and then aimed a salvo of 6 torpedoes and fired. This was the first ship he had ever torpedoed. It was just a few minutes after midnight when the first torpedo struck the starboard side and blew off an estimated 50+ feet of the bow skyward, killing everyone sleeping there. A second torpedo struck just seconds later, striking on the starboard side in the machinery spaces near a powder magazine and one of her fuel oil bunkers. The explosion knocked out all electric power aboard the ship. She began to go down by the bow and then to list to her starboard side. 3 SOS distress signals were sent out. Officers began to shout, ordering all hands to abandon ship, and by the hundreds they jumped into the ink-black midnight sea, taking their burned and wounded shipmates with them. Within about 12 minutes, the Indianapolis rolled completely over to starboard and went rapidly down bow first. Of the 1,197 officers and men aboard, survivors estimated at about 880 men, many badly burned, maimed, and wounded, made it alive into the sea in the early minutes of Monday, July 30, 1945. It took only 12 minutes, shorter than the halftime of a football game, but enough time to kill about 300 men and put the rest in the water. Scattered 600 miles west of Guam, 550 miles east of Leyte, and 250 miles from the Palau Islands, the closest land. 12 minutes. 880 men were now scattered over miles of open sea. They had no water and no food. Some had Kapok life jackets. Many did not. Life rafts were precious few. The rafts, which were designed to float free of the ship, failed to do so. Floater nets provided safety for some. Fuel oil from the ship's ruptured tanks coated the sea and the men, making most of them violently ill. When the sun rose on that first day, there was reason for optimism. After all, the crew knew they were to join up with the USS Idaho the next day for gunnery practice. Surely they'd be missed, and search missions would immediately be mounted. However, such was not the case. And for the next 5 days and nights, the men of the Indianapolis would know terror, thirst, hunger, and despair on a massive scale. Many would give up in the struggle and slip silently beneath the sea, never to be seen again by their shipmates. Shark attacks began with the coming of daylight on Monday. One by one, sharks began to pick off the men on the outer perimeter of the group. The survivors said the sharks were always there by the hundreds. It was a terror-filled ordeal, never knowing if you'd be the next victim. And by the third day, lack of water and food, combined with the unrelenting shark terror, began to take its effect on the mental stability of the men. Many began to hallucinate, going from sanity to the world of fantasy. Some who had taken in seawater went slowly mad and drowned. Fights broke out. Hope faded. By Wednesday evening, survivors estimated that only about 400 were still alive. Then at about 10:25 on Thursday morning, August 2, Lieutenant Wilbur Gwynn's Ventura PV-1 bomber out of Peleliu Air Base was on a routine anti-submarine patrol. Gwynn was in the rear of the plane trying to solve a binding problem with the antenna winch of the plane. He was leaning out of the plane, guiding the wire, when he chanced to glance down at the ocean and change the fate of 317 men. He had spotted a huge oil slick, and thinking that the large oil slick indicated that an enemy submarine had just submerged beneath his plane, he dropped down for a depth charge run. The bomb bay doors were open, ready to drop depth charges on the suspected enemy sub. Gwynn glanced down out the window just as he was about to release his depth charges. And there, spread out over the ocean, were hundreds of delirious men stranded in the middle of nowhere, waving to get his attention. Gwynn then at 11:25 radioed his base at Peleliu, quote, "Many men in the water," and gave his latitude and longitude. He followed the oil slick and saw more men in the sea, an estimated total of about 150, and wondered where had they come from. He dropped all the supplies he had and then sent a revised message. Quote, "Send rescue ships, survivors in life rafts, and jackets," unquote. In the end, it was the oil slick that saved 317 men. Their fuel state near critical now, Gwynn and his crew then headed back to Peleliu, little knowing the part fate played in their life or the lives of 317 American sailors and Marines. Some 3 hours later, after Gwynn's first report, a PBY Catalina flying boat headed out at 12:40 from Peleliu with pilot Lieutenant R. Adrian Marks. It was loaded with 12 hours of fuel, flares, life rafts, and dye markers for a 3-hour flight to the survivors. And arriving at the survivors' location at about 1600 hours, Marks dropped to about 100 feet above the surface of the sea, while his crew began dropping rafts and supplies. And while this was happening, his crew informed him they could see men being attacked by sharks. And upon seeing these men under shark attack, the crew voted to abandon standing Navy orders prohibiting landing in open seas. Well, Marks landed the PBY in a daring maneuver between swells in a power on stall, tail low, nose high attitude. He had popped some rivets and cracked at the seams, slowly taking on water, but for the most part, it held. He taxied his plane as close as he could and immediately began taking survivors aboard. Some survivors were so weakened by their ordeal that when they slipped out of their K-Pop life jackets, they drowned while attempting to swim to the plane. Learning that the men were from the Indianapolis, Marks frantically radioed for help, and service ships began converging on the rescue site. When the PBY's fuselage was full, the crew carried men onto the wings and tied them on with ropes. All night long, Marks and his crew fought to get as many as possible out of the shark-infested sea. Adrian Marks and his courageous crew that day saved 56 men, a record that has never been equaled for a plane of that size. By midnight, Marx's PBY was a floating, unflyable hulk. At 0015 on August 3, the USS Doyle, the first rescue ship on site, came alongside and transferred the plane's survivors until 0300. The plane was then destroyed by gunfire from the U.S. Doyle and sunk at 0730. 7 ships, led by the USS Bassett, picked up survivors, and search efforts continued until August 8, until no other survivors were found. After being fed fruit and water, the survivors were treated for exhaustion, dehydration, shark bites, saltwater ulcers, shock, burns, and malnutrition. Of the 1,197 crew members aboard the Indianapolis when she sailed for Leyte, 317 survived. 91 floating bodies were eventually recovered afterward. After attempts at identification were made, the deceased were wrapped in weighted canvas covers, and a burial at sea service with prayer was conducted, each committed to a sailor's grave, marked by latitude and longitude of the burial site. Everyone else either went down with the ship or disappeared into the deep. The impact of this unexpected disaster of the loss of the Indianapolis sent shockwaves of hushed disbelief throughout Navy circles in the South Pacific. Incidentally, just 3 days later, on August 6, 1945, a solitary B-29 heavy bomber, the Enola Gay, flown by Paul Tibbets and his crew, with a single bomb in its bomb bay, headed out of Tinian for Hiroshima, Japan. Aboard the plane was one of the atomic bombs delivered by the Indianapolis. A public announcement of the loss of the Indianapolis was delayed for almost 2 weeks after the sinking, thus ensuring that it would be overshadowed in the news of the day when the Japanese surrender was announced by President Harry Truman, as shown on this New York Times front page of August 15, 1945. The Navy, however, was rushing to gather the facts and to determine who was responsible for the greatest sea disaster in its history. Who, in fact, to blame? It was a faulty rush to judgment. Evidence withheld. It is important to note at the onset that vital information pertinent to determining responsibility for the loss of the Indianapolis was not made public until long after the subsequent court-martial and conviction of its captain, Charles B. McVeigh. U.S. intelligence, using a top-secret operation labeled Ultra, had broken the Japanese code and was aware that 2 Japanese submarines, including the I-58, were operating in the path of the Indianapolis. This information was classified and not made available to either the court-martial board or to Captain McVeigh's defense counsel. It did not become known until the early 1990s that, despite knowledge of the danger in its path, naval authorities at Guam had sent the Indianapolis into harm's way, without any warning, refusing her captain's request for a destroyer escort and leading him to believe his route was safe. The Court of Inquiry. A hasty convened closed-door court of inquiry was convened by Fleet Admiral Chester Nimitz in Guam on August 13, 1945, to investigate the sinking, with the prosecutor stating that they were, quote, starting the proceedings without having available all the necessary data, unquote. Little was done to add to such data prior to the court's decision. 43 witnesses were interviewed. As the first witness, Captain McVeigh was asked whether he had been zigzagging the night the ship sank. His answer was simply, quote, "No, sir," unquote. But apparently little weight was given to the fact that he was under orders to zigzag at his discretion. Testimony by survivors that visibility was severely limited the night of the attack, thus explaining Captain McVeigh's orders to cease zigzagging, was heard but never considered again, either then or at the subsequent court-martial. The surface operations officer at Guam, who had sent the Indianapolis across the Philippine Sea without a destroyer escort, and who was responsible for advising Captain McVeigh of any perils in his path, testified that the danger was, quote, "practically negligible," unquote. This comment had a self-serving impact of diverting attention from his own culpability for not heeding McVeigh's request for an escort. The Court of Inquiry ultimately recommended that Captain McVeigh be court-martialed on two vague charges. One, culpable inefficiency in the performance of his duties, and two, negligently endangering the lives of others. Over 350 Navy warships had been lost in combat during World War II, but none of their captains had ever been court-martialed. When the war ended, the scene then shifted to Washington, D.C., when orders were given to proceed with the court-martial of Captain McVeigh. Only days before the trial actually began on December 3, 1945, he and his defense counsel learned for the first time of the charges against him. Another irony in this trial was that a decision was also made to bring the Japanese submarine commander Hashimoto to the trial as a witness. Public animosity toward the Japanese was still very high, and using Hashimoto, so recently an enemy, as a witness against an American officer created a storm of controversy, both in the media and in the halls of Congress. The Navy finally had decided on two charges against Captain McVeigh. There was no evidence to substantiate the first charge, which was failure to issue timely orders to abandon ship. The second charge was that he had hazarded his ship by failing to zigzag in good visibility. Here are the facts which made this charge shamefully unjust. 1. The orders which he received in Guam directed him to zigzag at his discretion. 2. No Navy directive existed then required zigzagging at night in limited visibility. 3. The charge against him stated that the visibility was good on the night of the sinking, a fact never contested by the inexperienced defense counsel assigned to McVeigh. 4. When McVeigh issued orders to cease zigzagging before midnight, visibility, according to all eyewitnesses aboard the ship, was and remained very poor up to the time of the torpedo attack. 5. Statements taken by survivors immediately after rescue that the visibility was severely limited were not made available as evidence at the court-martial. And 6, the commander of the Japanese submarine which sank the Indianapolis and who testified at the court-martial said that he could have sunk the ship whether it had been zigzagging or not. And so, the Navy court-martial found Captain Charles B. McVeigh guilty of hazarding his ship by failure to zigzag in good visibility, thus diverting attention from so many others whose negligence and misjudgments were the real cause of this tragedy, humiliating Captain McVeigh and damaging his promising career beyond repair. It was reasonable to assume from the evidence that a decision to convict McVeigh was made before his court-martial began. The survivors of the Indianapolis were convinced that he was made a scapegoat to hide the mistakes of others, which included sending him into harm's way without warning and failing to notice when the Indianapolis failed to arrive in Leyte on schedule. Due to a combination of communication errors, military protocol, and scheduling bureaucracy, the Navy had never sent a search party to look for the Indianapolis, even though it had not reached its destination on time. Although the first organized effort by survivors to clear Captain McVeigh's name did not commence until 1960, when the Indianapolis Survivors Organization was formally organized, it was never able to gain sufficient public attention until 1996, 51 years after the ship sinking, when an 11-year-old boy, Hunter Scott, from Pensacola, Florida, saw the movie Jaws and was moved by the very accurate soliloquy of one of the actors, Robert Shaw, who explained his hatred for sharks by telling his story of surviving the attack upon the Indianapolis survivors. When told by his father that the actor was describing an event which was true, young Hunter began researching the story for what became an award-winning school history project. But then, still fascinated, Hunter pursued it further. Hunter Scott's history teacher had told him that interviews with individuals who had lived through historical events were a primary resource and very valuable. So he decided to try and locate survivors of the Indianapolis. He put an ad in his local newspaper requesting information about the Indianapolis and survivors. A first response to the ad helped him locate survivor Maurice Glenn Bell from Mobile, Alabama. So Hunter set up an interview with Mr. Bell. His story was even more chilling than the scene in Jaws. Bell believed that Captain McVeigh had been done an injustice. After the interview, Hunter said that, quote, "My project became a mission," unquote. He decided to right a wrong that had been done more than 50 years before. Bell gave Hunter a list of the remaining survivors at that time, to whom Hunter sent a questionnaire. Of the 317 men who survived the sinking, 154 were still alive in 1996. These men ranged in age from 69 to 92. He received more than 80 replies. And one of the questions was whether they felt Captain McVeigh's court-martial was justified and his conviction fair. The answers, filled with outrage, were unanimous. A dreadful wrong had been committed. These men and their testimony helped Hunter become even more committed to helping restore the reputation of their captain and honor their own heroism. Many survivors decided for the first time in their lives to write about what happened to them during their 5 days and nights in the ocean, surrounded by sharks and death. Many had never told their own children what they told Hunter. Some of the material sent was so graphic that Hunter's father decided not to let Hunter read some of it. These responses sent Hunter Scott on a crusade to clear Captain McVeigh's name. And because of his youth, he attracted media attention, which in turn attracted the attention of the Survivors Organization and that of his member of Congress, Representative Joe Scarborough in Florida. This led to invitations to Hunter first to the 1996 Survivors Reunion in Indianapolis, then to join a group of survivors in Hawaii in 1997. It also led to a promise from Scarborough that he would introduce legislation in 1998. In April 1998, 15 survivors and Hunter Scott traveled to Washington, D.C. and met with members of both House and Senate, urging their support for Scarborough's bill, H.R. 3610, which urged a presidential pardon for Captain McVeigh. Then in 1999, Scarborough introduced a joint resolution, H.J. Resolution 48, with Hunter and 14 survivors in attendance, which expressed a sense of Congress that Captain McVeigh's court-martial was morally unsustainable and that his conviction was a miscarriage of justice. On this visit, they persuaded Senator Bob Smith to introduce an identical companion measure in the Senate, Resolution 23. A major breakthrough occurred when Senator Smith persuaded Senator John Warner, then chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, to hold a hearing on his joint resolution. At this hearing on September 14, 1999, at the age of 14, Hunter Scott testified along with 10 survivors. Senator Warner informed Hunter that he was the youngest witness ever to appear before his committee. Senator Warner said that he had come to the hearing fully ready to support the Navy's position, but had, quote, righted his course, unquote, quote, after listening to their testimony. During 2000, there was a constant stream of letters from survivors and their friends to Senator Warner and consistent support from the media, including an excellent cover article by Peter Moss in the Parade magazine of August 20, 2000, entitled, quote, "It's Time to Right a Wrong," unquote, pictured here. 2 months later, on October 20, 2000, a joint House-Senate Resolution 48 was agreed upon and passed. The survivors of the great disaster pronounced themselves satisfied with the outcome. In essence, it was the, quote, sense of Congress that the American people should now recognize Captain McVeigh's lack of culpability for the tragic loss of the USS Indianapolis and the lives of the men who died as a result of the sinking of the vessel. It further declared that in light of the fact that certain exculpatory information was not available to the court-martial board and that Captain McVeigh's conviction resulted therefrom, Captain McVeigh's military record should now reflect that he is exonerated for the loss of the USS Indianapolis and so many of her crew. As an end note, one of the things that Hunter Scott found difficulty understanding at the age of 14 was what must have been going through Captain McVeigh's mind when at the age of 70, on a cold November day back in 1968, he lay down in the front yard outside his home in Litchfield, Connecticut, and shot himself through the head with his Navy-issued .38 caliber revolver. Hunter also could not understand why relatives of the men who died on the Indianapolis sent McVeigh hate mail for the rest of his life, hounding him long after the fact. It took the Indianapolis only 12 minutes to sink. It took her captain 23 years and 3 months to follow her down. No one will ever know exactly what he was thinking when he pulled the trigger, as he left no suicide note. In his left hand was a metal toy sailor, a worn memento from happier times. He'd been given this toy sailor as a gift when he was a boy. As a credit to Hunter Scott, he knew that there was something confusing that needed to be clarified, and something wrong that needed to be corrected. And he did something about it. Hunter wanted to honor a group of veterans to whom honor was everything. In August 2013, just a year ago, there were only 38 of the 317 men left who survived the sinking of the Indianapolis in 1945. 13 of them gathered in the ship's namesake city of Indianapolis for the final large-scale reunion of the ship's dwindling number of survivors. They were now in their late 80s and 90s. Clarence Hirschberger, an 87-year-old survivor from Florida shown here, hadn't planned on attending the reunion as he had been feeling poorly, but decided to make the trip to Indianapolis. He said that when all of the survivors are gone, he hopes the survivors' relatives and others keep reminding the public about the ship and its crew's sacrifice. Quote, "Somebody's got to keep the story alive," unquote, Hirschberger said. And I guess that's what I'm hoping to do a little bit with this presentation. Also attending that reunion in August was Hunter Scott, who was then a 28-year-old Navy helicopter pilot based in California. Hunter said, quote, "There are 38 of them left, and I really wanted to see these guys and catch up. They're like grandfathers to me, and it's like seeing family. They're heroes," unquote. And in honor of all these heroes, both living and dead, I would like to close this presentation with the first verse of the Navy hymn that I understand is usually sung on ships on Sunday services for many, many years. Eternal Father, strong to save, whose arm does rule the restless wave, who bids the mighty ocean deep its own appointed limits keep. Oh, hear us when we cry to thee for those in peril on the sea. And as a short epilogue, and something that I just recently came upon in my research, in December of 1990, 45 years after the sinking of the Indianapolis, one of the survivors, Giles McCoy, met up with the Japanese submarine commander, Hashimoto, at a meeting in Hawaii. After a very long conversation between the two adversaries, McCoy faced Hashimoto and said, quote, "Sir, I am the representative of all those that were aboard the Indianapolis on that fateful night. And I feel that you were doing your duty just as we were. And I forgive you," unquote. The very second that message had been delivered to Hashimoto through his interpreter, Hashimoto said, quote, to the interpreter, "I forgive you too," unquote. McCoy immediately questioned the interpreter, quote, "What is he forgiving me for?" unquote. Hashimoto's response was, quote, "The bomb you delivered to Tinian was dropped on my hometown, Hiroshima, and it killed my entire family," unquote. And at that moment, McCoy put his hand on his heart, took a deep breath, and sat down in the nearest chair. The years of hatred and frustration left him. He then turned to Hashimoto and said, quote, "I never knew. I'm sorry," unquote. It was apparent the war had taken a toll on everyone. No one was exempt. And I thank you for this, listening to this great moment. And the list shown here and also on my research table over here are copies of the book from which I gathered this presentation. And also, I mentioned that I've been a student of history for 3 years. When I was a boy of 9 on December 7, 1941, I started scrapbooking World War II on December 8, and ended up by September 2nd, 1945 with 8 scrapbooks. My mother never threw anything away, and I still have those 8 scrapbooks, 2 of which, the first one and the 8th one, are on the table over here, along with copies of the Indianapolis newspapers, of which there were 3, Indianapolis Star, Times, and News, on August 14 and 15. In fact, I was a Indianapolis Times carrier salesman for the Indianapolis Times at that time in 1945, and I delivered the paper that you see up here laying, listed on one of these boards up here. Those are the actual papers from that time. Are there any questions or comments? Yes, sir.
That early photo you had there that showed the Indianapolis was torpedoed, was that an actual photo that was taken by the submarine? No. That was just
no. I didn't think it.
I didn't think anybody was there. As far as
no.
They just assumed that was.
I found that one out that kind of represented what that was like.
Okay.
Any other questions or comments?
Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.